The strangest part of the story isn't what the officers heard at night, it's that they all heard the same things. From multiple sections of the Western Front, from officers and enlisted men representing 7 different armies, the reports arrived through different channels, at different times, from men who had never met each other and had no opportunity to coordinate their accounts. And yet the accounts were consistent. Rifle shots at odd hours with no accompanying offensive action visible from either trench line. Sounds from the dark that were not wind and not artillery and not rats. And beneath it all, underneath the distant percussion of the guns, voices. Human voices, in multiple languages, rising and falling in what sounded like argument or celebration or something else entirely that nobody had a clean word for. The sounds of people who were neither British nor German and who were, by any official accounting, nowhere at all. No Man's Land was the strip of ground between the opposing trench systems. On some sections of the front it was 30 yards wide, on others a quarter mile. It was covered in barbed wire that had been strung, cut, shelled, and restrung so many times over 4 years that it had become a permanent environmental feature, a tangle so dense and so complex that it had developed its own ecosystem of rust and bone and fabric. Shell craters filled with water and the things that floated in it. There were unexploded artillery shells in it, and the remains of horses and vehicles and the equipment of men from 19 nations. Nothing was supposed to be alive in it for any extended period. Nothing was supposed to inhabit it. It was, by definition, the space that belonged to no one. The reports began circulating in 1916, though some soldiers believed the phenomenon was older, going back to the stalemate of late 1914 when both sides dug in and the front lines stopped moving and men began to understand that this was not a temporary situation, but a permanent condition. A legend spread from unit to unit, passed between men in the way that information travels in enclosed communities under extreme stress, by whisper, by inference, by the look on someone's face when they came back from the wire at 3 in the morning and didn't want to talk about what they'd heard. Lieutenant Colonel Arden Arthur Hume Beeman of the British Cavalry wrote about it in 1920, just 2 years after the armistice, in a memoir called The Squadroon. He was not a fanciful man. He was a career officer with the flat, systematic worldview of someone who had spent years in the professional hierarchy of the British military, and he wrote about the wild men of No Man's Land with the same measured tone he used to describe supply logistics and cavalry formations. At the Battle of the Somme in early 1918, he wrote, he watched 24 German prisoners of war walk into an area of abandoned trenches and simply cease to exist. They did not emerge from the other side, they did not appear in any prisoner records, they walked in and were gone, as cleanly as if the ground had opened and taken them. He considered sending a search party. He was advised strongly against it. The officer who advised him explained that the area, a network of abandoned and collapsed trenches extending for miles through the shattered landscape, was inhabited not by enemy combatants with a chain of command and a supply line and any recognizable military structure, by something else. Deserters from multiple armies who had slipped away from their respective units over the preceding years and gone underground. Into the old tunnels, the collapsed dugouts, the shell crater networks beneath No Man's Land. They had been down there for months, some of them reportedly for over a year. They had stopped reporting to any authority. They had stopped obeying any flag. They existed outside the entire architecture of the war that had created them. They emerged at night to take what they needed from the dead. At first, rations, then clothing when clothing wore out, then as months became a year, and then more as the darkness and the isolation and the particular diet of life underground worked its slow and irreversible changes on minds and bodies that had already been pushed to the edges of what humans can absorb, other things. Things the officer described only obliquely because the language for them didn't exist in any form he was willing to use in front of his commanding officer. They had stopped being soldiers. They had stopped being men in the way that word was commonly understood by people who had not spent 14 months in a tunnel eating whatever the dark provided. They were something the war had produced that the war had no taxonomy for, humans who had decided that dying slowly underground in the company of the dead was preferable to dying quickly in the open under orders, and who had made adaptations to that decision that couldn't be undone. Every army heard the sounds. British officers pulled their men back from the parapet at night when they caught them leaning over the edge, staring out into the dark, listening to voices rising from positions that should have been empty. The voices spoke in English and German and French and Australian English mixed together, the way languages mix in places where national identity has been stripped away by something more fundamental than nationality. None of the salvage teams that worked the ground after the armistice ventured into the deeper tunnel systems alone or after dark. Some of the men on those teams, former soldiers themselves, men who had spent years in the trenches and thought they had been immunized against surprise by everything they had already witnessed, refused to work in the sectors where the sounds had been reported, and their refusals were accommodated without paperwork because the officers who managed those teams had heard the sounds too and did not want to issue a written order about them. The official instructions to those teams, distributed through military command channels and preserved in several national archives, specified that any underground passages encountered were to be sealed without entry. Paul Fussell, the scholar who studied the Great War more closely and more honestly than almost anyone before or since, called the legend of the Wild Men the finest story to emerge from the entire conflict, not because of its entertainment value, but because it was the only story that told the complete truth about what the Western Front was actually doing to the people caught inside it. Strip away civilization one layer at a time. Take the food, take the safety, take the belonging, take the purpose, take the sleep, take the future. Keep a man alive just enough to keep making choices, and you will find out what he chooses. What the war built between the trenches was not a ghost story, it was a mirror. Every soldier who stood at the parapet in the dark and listened to those sounds was looking at himself, at what he was 2 bad winters and 1 abandoned post away from becoming. That's why the legend spread from army to army across thousands of miles of front, passing between men who had never met and would never meet. Not because it was comforting, because it was the most frightening kind of true. No Man's Land was cleared after the armistice, the tunnels were sealed, the ground was slowly returned to farmland over decades. Some sections remain permanently off limits today, the Zone Rouge, the French government calls it, because the soil is still saturated with unexploded shells and chemical residue that has not degraded in a century underground. Nobody knows how many men went into those tunnels. Nobody knows how many of them were still alive in November 1918 when the guns stopped. In the years afterward, in towns across Britain and France and Australia, men appeared who had been listed as missing for years, gaunt, quiet, changed in ways that no medical terminology of the period could adequately describe. Some of them talked, most didn't. They had been somewhere. They didn't say what. The last sound the man made wasn't a scream, it was a whisper. And Corporal Louis Barthas carried it inside him for the next 36 years. It was the winter of 1916, somewhere deep in the trench network of northern France, where the Western Front had stopped moving and started rotting. What had once been countryside, farmland, villages, church spires rising into clear autumn sky had been hammered into a lunar wasteland 12,000 miles long. And the mud. If you've never read about the mud of the Western Front, understand this: it wasn't ordinary mud, it was a compound. Artillery shells churned the earth so completely, so repeatedly for so many months that the soil became fused with the remains of men who had already been buried in it, bones and leather and iron and flesh pressed together under rain and weight until it became something new, something thick, something that grabbed. Corporal Louis Barthas was a barrel maker from a wine-growing village in the south of France. He had 2 boys at home, Abel, 10, and André, 8, and a wife who maintained the household and prayed over the same photograph of him every night. He was 37 years old, politically a socialist, personally a pacifist, and professionally now a killer, because the French army had arrived at his door in August 1914 and handed him a rifle before he had time to explain the contradiction. He survived because of instinct and luck, and because of a gift for observation that compelled him to write everything down. Every night, when he could hold a pencil and find paper that wasn't soaked through, he wrote. He wrote in the dark, with shells landing close enough to shake the dirt from the walls of his dugout onto the page. That winter, he was marching his squad through a flooded communication trench after midnight. There were no lanterns. Light meant death. No moon, just the mechanical wet sound of boots pulling free from the mud with each step and the rhythm of men trying to breathe quietly in the cold. The smell was everywhere, always, that particular Western Front smell that veterans never described precisely because precision would require remembering it accurately, and nobody wanted to do that. They had been walking for hours. Everyone was exhausted in the way that goes past the body and into something deeper, something that changes a person permanently. Barthas had stopped feeling ordinary fear weeks ago. What replaced it was a kind of hollow endurance. You marched because stopping was death. You kept your head down because lifting it was death. You looked at the ground in front of you, and you did not look at the things that floated in the water at the bottom of the trench, because those things didn't need to be looked at. Then they heard the voice. It was low and steady, and it was coming from somewhere ahead around a bend in the trench. Not screaming, not pleading, just speaking, with the terrible preternatural calm of a man who has already fought panic for 5 hours and lost, and found something colder on the other side of losing. They turned the corner and stopped. A French infantryman was standing in the trench. His arms were free. His rifle was gone, swallowed an hour before. He had been there since before dark. The mud had consumed him to the waist. His uniform from the belt down was simply absent, and each time he shifted even the smallest amount, the earth made a quiet sound, and he sank another fraction. His face was grey from cold and hours of effort, but his eyes were clear. That was what Barthas noted later. The eyes were completely clear. Some of his men grabbed the soldier's arms immediately and pulled. 2 men, then 3, boots skidding back across the slick floor of the trench. They pulled until their hands went white, and the trapped man made a sound that seemed to come from somewhere structural, from below the level of pain, the sound of something fundamental being tested. They tried looping a belt around his chest. They tried digging at the mud beside him with bare hands, but the walls of the trench were saturated, and the mud simply poured back in faster than they could remove it, indifferent, mechanical, unhurried. The earth was not letting go. It had never let go of anything it wanted. Behind them, the column was moving. The squad ahead had already gone around the next bend and disappeared into the dark. The gap between Barthas's men and the column was growing with every second they stood still. In those trenches at that hour, losing your unit wasn't an inconvenience. It meant wandering alone through a maze of flooded passages until either the cold or the enemy resolved the situation. The war processed stragglers the same way the mud processed everything else, silently, completely, without leaving a trace. The trapped man was looking at Barthas now. He had read something in the expressions around him that nobody had yet put into words. "Put a bullet in me," he said, not loudly, not desperately, the way a man might ask someone to close a door they had left open. Nobody moved. "I'm begging you," he said, "do it now while you can still see my face. Don't leave me here alone when it gets dark and the water gets higher. Please, I'm asking you as a man." Barthas wrote about this moment 30 years later in his notebooks, 19 handwritten journals, kept in a drawer given to no one for decades, the mud-stained record of everything he had witnessed in 4 years at the front. He wrote that the silence following that request was unlike any silence he had experienced during the entire war, deeper than the lull between bombardments, heavier than the quiet after a man died beside him. He wrote that several of his men looked away. He wrote that he himself opened his mouth and then could not find what to put in it. They could not do it, not because they had done a calculation, not because of the Geneva Convention or military law or any other institutional abstraction. They could not do it because none of them could be the specific human being who looked into another man's clear living eyes and pulled the trigger. That final, stubborn, completely irrational refusal was human in a way nothing else about the Western Front was human anymore. And both they and the trapped man understood, in that moment, that the refusal was its own kind of cruelty, perhaps a worse one than the bullet would have been. Barthas gave the order to move. He had to. The column would not come back for them. They walked away. The boots resumed their rhythm. The voice faded behind them as they went deeper into the trench network, getting smaller and then gone, swallowed by the mud and the dark and the particular silence of no man's land at 2 in the morning. Not one of his men spoke for a long time. Not one of them looked back. He never found out what happened to the man. There was no search party. No report was filed. The mud of northern France had been absorbing men without paperwork since 1914. A soldier who disappeared in a flooded trench at midnight was a number in a column that had already become unreadable from the sheer weight of what it contained. Barthas came home in 1919. He went back to his barrels and his boys and his southern village and his wife who still had the photograph. He never attended veteran ceremonies. He never shook the hands of generals. He wrote instead, filling notebook after notebook with everything he had seen and smelled and heard and refused to do, the complete testimony of an ordinary man who was sent to an extraordinary hell and came back changed in ways that couldn't be talked about at dinner. His notebook sat in a drawer for 60 years. His grandson found them. A historian named Rémy Casals published them in 1978, 30 years after Barthas died. They are now considered one of the most important primary documents of the First World War. Archaeologists in northern France still find soldiers in the ground every year. Bones, buttons, identification discs when the men are lucky enough to have been buried with them. Each one gets a small ceremony. Most have no name. The mud never gave back what it took. It still hasn't. His brother had been dead for 2 years when the warm hands woke him. Corporal Will R. Bird of the 42nd Battalion, the Black Watch of Canada, was not a man given to stories about the supernatural. He was from Nova Scotia, from a small town called Amherst, a place of practical people who worked with their hands and measured the world in distances and weather and the specific reliability of equipment. He had come to the war the hard way. He had tried to enlist in August 1914 at the age of 23 and been rejected because his teeth were broken from a hockey injury. He went home while his younger brother Stephen enlisted and sailed for France in 1915. Stephen was 22 years old. Before he left, he said something to Will that Will wrote down later and never forgot. "If I don't come back, maybe I'll find a way to come sometime and whisper in your ear." Stephen was killed in October 1915, a German mine explosion in the Ypres sector. He was buried in France in ground that would be shelled into an unrecognizable landscape within 6 months. When the telegram came to Amherst, Will Bird read it twice, put it in a drawer, and went to the Army recruitment office the following morning. He had teeth removed to meet the physical standard. He was accepted. He sailed in early 1916. He became a sniper first, then a patrolman, the soldiers who went out into no man's land at night to observe enemy positions, to cut or repair wire, and to return before dawn with whatever information they had gathered and whatever pieces of themselves they had managed to keep intact in the dark. It was work that required the ability to stay completely still for extended periods in cold, wet darkness, to hear sounds at distances that most people never train their hearing to reach, and to make calm decisions about life and death in conditions that were designed to make calm decisions impossible. Bird was good at it. He survived Passchendaele and Arras and Cambrai and the Vimy-Lens sector and the final 100 grinding days of the war. He survived because he was skilled, and because he was careful, and because of something else. Something he wrote about in 2 separate published books, and that he maintained to anyone who asked him for the rest of his long life was absolutely and literally true. It was the days immediately following the Battle of Vimy Ridge, April 1917. The Canadian Corps had just accomplished something the British and French armies had failed at repeatedly over 3 years. They had taken the ridge from the Germans, a military achievement that became a defining moment of Canadian national identity and cost more than 4,000 Canadian lives in 4 days of fighting. The landscape around the ridge was destruction of surpassing completeness. No tree above knee height, no structure above rubble. The entire surface of the earth rearranged into a geometry of craters and wire and the equipment of men who no longer needed equipment. Bird had been on a nighttime work detail, digging new trench sections, stringing wire along the forward positions in the dark, the ordinary brutal labor that followed a battle whose outcome had been settled but whose danger had not diminished. He finished after midnight, exhausted at a depth below which exhaustion has any useful name, and found 2 men from his platoon who offered to share their bivouac, a small shelter dug into an embankment, a ground sheet fastened across the opening to hold in warmth. He crawled in. He was asleep almost immediately. He woke to pressure on his hands, not on his face, not on his shoulder, on both hands simultaneously, a warm, firm grip, the kind that means intention rather than accident. He opened his eyes in the dark interior of the bivouac and looked at what was holding them. It was Stephen. Not a shape that resembled Stephen, not a trick of darkness and exhaustion, not the visual hallucination that sleep deprivation can produce in men who have been half awake for 30 hours in a landscape designed to generate maximum fear. It was his brother, in uniform, looking at him with an expression Bird described as deeply calm. Not the blankness of shock, but the specific, focused calm of a person who knows exactly what they're doing and has very limited time to do it. Stephen gripped his hands, held them long enough that Bird was fully awake and could not mistake what he was seeing, and then rose and moved toward the entrance of the shelter. He turned once, at the opening. He gestured for Will to follow. Bird gathered his equipment and went after him. They moved through the trenches, past dugouts where Bird could see the sleeping shapes of men from his platoon, past the supply areas and communication passages and the endless mud of the post-battle ground. Bird followed his dead brother through a landscape so thoroughly destroyed it had ceased to resemble anything that had ever been France. They moved for several minutes in silence, the way brothers sometimes move together, without needing to explain direction or purpose. Then Bird's equipment shifted on his shoulder and fell, and in the moment he bent to recover it, Stephen turned a corner ahead and was gone. Bird followed the corner. There was nothing there but empty trench and darkness. He stood in the cold for a long time, not moving. Then, behind him, he heard the explosion. A German artillery shell had struck the bivouac, a direct hit, the exact point in the embankment where Bird had been sleeping, where 2 men from his platoon had still been sleeping, men who had not been woken by warm hands in the night, was destroyed. The shelter was gone. Both men were dead. Bird told his platoon what had happened. He told his sergeant. He wrote it in his diary that same night, in handwriting that was reportedly steady, the way it always was because Bird was that kind of man. He wrote about it again in his 1930 memoir, And We Go On. He wrote about it again in the book he published in 1968, the book he named after the most specific detail he could never explain, Ghosts Have Warm Hands. Across 38 years and 2 separate published accounts, he never changed a single detail. He was a journalist and a novelist, professionally trained in the difference between what happened and what could be improved by invention. He maintained, without variation, that he was describing exactly and only what he had experienced. Tim Cook, the Canadian War Museum's leading historian of the First World War, studied Bird's accounts extensively and wrote about them in the Journal of Military History. Whatever interpretation one applied to the incident, supernatural, psychological, the product of grief operating on a mind primed by years of extreme vigilance, the emotional truth it contained was representative of something universal among the men of the Western Front. The dead were never entirely absent from those trenches. They were in the soil under every boot, in the air everyone breathed, in the faces of every living man who was slowly becoming one of them. The barrier between the living and the dead on the Western Front was not a wall, it was a membrane. Bird survived the war. He won the Military Medal for Bravery on the final day of fighting, November 11, 1918, at Mons, Belgium. He came home. He named his only son Stephen. That son grew up reading his father's war writing. He enlisted in the Second World War. He went ashore at Juno Beach on June 6, 1944. He was killed in France on July 8, 1944. Will Bird spent the last 40 years of his life believing that his writing had sent his son to war and that his son's death was therefore, in some essential way, his fault. He lived until 1984. He wrote until the end. He never changed the story about the hands. He said it the same way every time. The hands were warm. Not cold, not the cold of the ground or the cold of France in April or the cold of a man who had been in the earth for 2 years. Warm. Like a brother who had come a long way to find him and was running out of time and needed him to get up and follow right now before it was too late. There are things that happen in war that soldiers don't put in their official reports. Lieutenant Spate was not a superstitious man. He had studied engineering before the war, he had a rational mind, and he had survived 2 years on the Western Front through careful observation and disciplined thinking, not through prayer or premonition or any belief in things that couldn't be measured. He was, by every account from the men who served under him, steady, the kind of officer you wanted in a dugout when the walls were shaking, because he never flinched and he never panicked and he always had a reason for every decision he made. This is what makes what he described so difficult to dismiss. The Ypres salient in Belgium was, by 1916, one of the most densely saturated killing grounds in human history. The city of Ypres itself, medieval, beautiful, famous for its cloth hall and its cathedral, had been reduced to a skeleton of roofless walls and exposed timber. The countryside around it was the same, a moonscape of craters and abandoned equipment and bodies that never quite stayed buried because the shelling never quite stopped. The British held a bulging line around the city, which meant they were surrounded on 3 sides by German positions, fired on from the front, the left, and the right simultaneously, a permanent geometry of death that had broken 3 successive armies and kept breaking new ones as fresh soldiers arrived and were fed into the machinery. The dugouts there were deep. You had to go deep because the German artillery knew exactly where the British lines were and shelled them on a schedule so regular the men could predict it. The deeper dugouts, 10-15 feet underground, had their own particular atmosphere, cold and damp, the constant faint sound of earth settling above your head, the smell of old timber and candle smoke, and men who hadn't properly washed in weeks. They were not comfortable, but they were, in the relative accounting of the Western Front, alive. Men slept in them whenever they weren't required to be in the open, which was as much as possible. Spate had been assigned to one of these positions for 3 weeks when the first encounter happened. He had fallen asleep at a small table. Still dressed, as was common, you slept in your uniform in case you needed to move quickly, which you always needed to do eventually. He woke in the small hours of the morning to find another officer standing at the far end of the dugout. He recognized the man immediately. It was a fellow officer, a friend, in the limited way that war permitted friendship, who had been killed in the sector 6 weeks earlier. Spate had attended the small burial. He had watched them put the man in the ground outside the wire. The figure was standing very still, looking at Spate with an expression that was not quite an expression, more the shape of one, the way a drawing of a face differs from a face. Then it turned and looked at the floor, not at Spate, at the floor, deliberately, slowly, the way you look at something when you're trying to direct another person's attention without using words. Then it was gone. Not gradually, not with any cinematic fading. Between one moment and the next, the figure was simply absent. The dugout was empty and cold and lit by the single candle Spate had left burning, and there was nothing in it except furniture and 2 sleeping enlisted men and the ordinary sounds of the front. Spate sat at the table for a long time in the dark. He was, he said later, not frightened. He was profoundly confused, the specific confusion of a man whose entire mental framework is built on the assumption that dead officers stay dead and who has just encountered data that his framework has no category for. He got up, walked to the spot on the floor where the figure had been looking, and stood over it. The earth looked ordinary. Boards, compacted soil, the faint impression of boots that could have belonged to anyone. He pressed his boot against the boards. They didn't flex in any unusual way. The sound was the same as anywhere else in the dugout, dull, solid, nothing underneath suggesting hollow space or recently disturbed ground. He stood there for 2 full minutes in the cold and the candlelight and could find nothing. He went back to sleep. He told no one. 3 nights later it came back. The same figure, the same stillness, but this time the pointing was more deliberate, more urgent somehow, with a quality that Spate described as structured, like receiving a clear order from a commanding officer whose face you can't see. The dead officer looked at the floor directly beneath his feet, and the look lasted long enough that Spate, sitting upright in the dark, felt something he would later describe not as fear but as instruction, as though he was being given specific information that he was required to act on. He felt the weight of it, the weight of someone who had come a considerable distance and had very limited time to make their purpose understood. In the morning, he told his sergeant he wanted the floorboards lifted at a particular location. He gave a mundane explanation, checking for water accumulation, inspecting the drainage. The sergeant complied without question because Spate was the kind of officer whose orders didn't require explanation, whose steadiness in 2 years of war had built an unspoken currency of trust. They dug 8 inches down. They found a German tunnel, and inside the tunnel, braced with careful timber framing and wired together with deliberate patient engineering, they found a charge of explosives. The detonation mechanism was set. Based on the condition of the components, it had approximately 13 hours remaining before it would fire. The dugout sat directly above. Every man in that section of the British line would have been killed without warning, without sound, without any possibility of reaction. The tunnel showed no signs at the surface, nothing to smell, nothing to see, nothing to hear. It had been designed to be invisible from above. The German engineers who built it had done excellent, careful work. Nothing would have found it. Nothing except a dead officer standing in the dark and looking at the floor. The charge was defused. Every man in that section of the line lived through that night and went on to the next night and the night after that. Spate filed no report about what had led him to order the search. He mentioned it, years later, in a private account, the kind that soldiers sometimes write in old age when they've stopped caring whether anyone believes them. He described the 2 appearances with the same precise, unembellished attention to detail he brought to everything, and noted that the figure had had what seemed like warm eyes, which he found strange for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, and that it had not seemed distressed, only purposeful. The way a man looks when he has one specific thing left to do and the time to do it is very short. The dead officer never appeared again after the explosives were found. Whether the tunnel would have been found by other means, perhaps, perhaps not. 13 hours is not a long time on a front where the shelling often prevented any systematic inspection for days at a stretch. A night raid, a supply inspection, a routine check, all of these were possible in 13 hours, and all of them were possible not to happen as well. Spate survived the war. He went home. He built things for the rest of his professional life, structures with solid foundations, buildings that knew what was underneath them. He lived to a reasonable age and was, by all accounts, content. The dead officer's name has been lost to the archive systems of a war that generated more documentation than any conflict in human history and still managed to misplace most of it. He is somewhere in the ground near Ypres, which is where most of the men who served in the salient eventually ended up. But for 3 nights in the cold dark of a Belgian winter, he stood in a dugout and pointed at the floor. And 13 hours before the end, someone finally listened. The worst part was never the weight of the earth. It was the silence. By the time the weight arrived, the ceiling caving, the walls folding inward, the sudden compression of what had been breathable air into something pressing and absolute, the silence had already begun. The silence was what the earth left you with when it was done moving. The silence was the medium you inhabited while you were still breathing and the world above you was not. Trench burial, being sealed alive under collapsed earth following an artillery strike, was among the most common fates on the Western Front and among the least discussed. There are reasons for this. Men who survived it were not, in the immediate aftermath, in any condition to write things down. The accounts they gave later, when they could speak again, tended to produce a specific reaction in listeners, a controlled retreat behind the eyes, a polite stillness that made the survivors stop mid-sentence and decide not to continue. And the men who didn't survive it left no record at all. They were simply gone, listed as missing or killed by shellfire, filed in a column of numbers that had become too large to read as anything except numbers. The figures are irrecoverable with any precision. Historian Tim Cook, researching the Canadian Expeditionary Force alone, found repeated references in unit diaries and medical records to men being entombed following bombardments, dug out hours or days afterward, sometimes alive, sometimes not alive but still warm, sometimes simply not there in any recoverable sense. The British and French armies processed similar events in similar volumes, multiplied across 4 years of continuous shelling along 12,000 miles of fortified line. Artillery caused approximately 60% of all casualties on the Western Front. A significant portion of those casualties were not men killed by the shell itself, but men killed by what the shell did to the ground around them. The secondary consequences, the earth turned into a weapon by the force of the initial event. You were sitting in a dugout. This is how most of the accounts begin. You were sitting in the dugout, doing something ordinary, eating, writing, cleaning your rifle, listening to someone else talk, and then the world compressed. The sound of the shell landing was often not remembered because the brain, under sufficient extremity, edits the input immediately preceding catastrophe. What the men reported was not the impact, it was the aftermath. The absolute total dark, the weight across the legs, the texture of soil against the face, gritty, cool, immediate, and the question that arrived with extraordinary clarity in the first seconds: how much air is there, and how long will it last? A French soldier, whose account was transcribed at a military hospital in Rouen in 1919, described coming to consciousness in complete darkness. He could not move his legs. He could move his left arm to a radius of approximately 4 inches before it met solid resistance. He could turn his head slightly to the left. He could breathe, but the breathing costs more with each cycle, the way a resource depletes faster when you're working hard and the supply isn't being replenished. He lay still and calculated as clearly as he could. He estimated he had been there for 2 or 3 hours, though he acknowledged this estimate was unreliable. Time in enclosed darkness without reference points operates on different principles than time in the open world. He screamed initially. Most of the accounts include this stage because it is not optional. The body's response to being sealed underground is immediate and involuntary regardless of military training or personal composure. After the screaming, a different kind of calculation begins. You become aware of your own oxygen consumption. You become aware that screaming accelerates it significantly. You become aware that stillness is, in measurable terms, a survival strategy. You become very, very still. This soldier, lying in the dark, became aware that the surface pressing against the right side of his face was not soil. The texture was different. He turned his head fractionally and pressed his cheek against it, and the shape of it registered in his hands before his mind was willing to process the shape, the specific curved firmness of something that had once been a shoulder joint, the weight and density of a thing that had finished settling. The fabric had been soaked and dried many times. He turned his face away and breathed very carefully and did not think about what he had just touched. He was not buried in a fresh collapse. This is what the worst accounts have in common. The discovery, made in darkness and limited movement, that the earth around them had been disturbed before, that the ground into which they had been compressed had already been used for something. Artillery shells churned the soil of northern France with total mechanical indifference to what the soil contained, and what it contained, by 1916 and certainly by 1917, was a mixture of geological material and the remains of men who had been buried in previous bombardments, and the remains of men who had been buried before them, layer upon layer, going back to the first winter of the war. The force of a new explosion didn't distinguish between these layers, it simply mixed them together and redistributed them. The soldier was dug out 9 hours later. He walked afterward. He returned to his village, married, raised children. He was by all outward appearances a functional human being for the remainder of his life, which was reasonably long. His family knew there was a locked room inside him. They knew this the way families always know without being told, but they didn't know what was in it. He told one person once, the doctor in Rouen in 1919 who was conducting the first systematic attempt to document what the Western Front had done to the men who came back from it. The doctor wrote it down in the flat, affectless prose of clinical documentation, the medical profession's method for managing proximity to the extreme. The file is in a French military archive. The soldier's name is redacted. His village is listed as somewhere in the Dordogne. His case number is 4,847. Which means there were 4,846 cases documented before his. In northern France and Belgium, they are still finding soldiers in the earth, every year, beneath construction sites, beneath the foundations of houses built on what is now ordinary suburban land, beneath agricultural fields that have been plowed for 3 generations. They surface when the ground is disturbed deeply enough, or when heavy rain shifts what the soil has held for a century. The French government employs teams specifically for this work, recovery and ordnance disposal combined, because the men and the unexploded shells are often found together, because the war did not sort these things neatly before burying them. Most of the recovered soldiers cannot be identified. They are interred in military cemeteries with small white stones and the phrase "unknown soldier." There are more of them in the ground than have ever been found. The earth of the Western Front gave back what it chose to give back, when it chose, and kept the rest. It is still keeping it now. The Belgian and French governments estimate that at current recovery rates, the last soldier will not be found for another 500 years. 500 years of white stones, 500 years of unknown soldier, 500 years of the earth slowly releasing what it decided in 1916 or 1917 or 1918 to take. It kept the man in Barthas's trench. It kept the men who went into no man's land. It kept 4,846 documented cases and an uncounted number of undocumented ones. It kept the silence. The silence that comes after the wait. The silence that waits in the dark while you are still breathing, measuring your air, learning to hold very still. The silence is still down there. In the deep ground of northern France, 9 inches below plough depth, where the roots of the crops don't reach and the frost doesn't reach and the sound of the surface world is distant and slow and very quiet. Still waiting for someone to listen. Thank you for staying till the end. If you loved listening the stories, please like and subscribe for stories like these every week, shared by real people. Comment below to let me know which story you found more disturbing. Thanks again for supporting the channel.